Now we can speak to Anushka Wijesinha, who is previously of a think tank in Sri Lanka, but now is advisor to the Minister of Trade and Commerce. So I think Anushka is particularly well placed to give us a view, perhaps on the study, as we've just talked about just now, but also trying to understand maybe some of the more specifics, and maybe even talk a little bit about, with the elections recently taking place in Sri Lanka, whether employment has now come centre stage, or what the implications are from your side. Anushka, please. Your microphone's on mute. You need to unmute your... there we are.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, good to see you.
And Laura, it's great to see you in person, having worked a lot over email during the course of this report. So it's really nice to join all of you. Let me make probably 5 to 6 main comments, and I think Laura suggested that I use the findings that were just shared as a point of departure and add something to that. And Bruce, like you said, I will come back to some thoughts on the current scenario right at the end. So the first, I think it's very clear that Sri Lanka is an unusual case in point, because despite having a 30-year conflict, growth never dipped below 4%. We had significant reductions in poverty, significant increases in employment, and a fair amount of structural transformation, along with this opening up of the Sri Lankan economy post 1977. But I think the results that are presented in the report, you would probably have seen even more remarkable results had the war and related unrest not happened, because shortly after both the first wave of liberalization in 1977 and the second wave of liberalizations and reforms in the 1990s, both were followed by years of very brutal conflict. So 1983 first, and then the mid-1990s with the failed peace talks and so on. So I think you would have probably seen a much more dramatic performance on employment had these conflicts not happened. And it's important to remember that along with the two waves of policy reforms, there were these trigger points of conflict that then lasted for years. So I think all of what the report talks about, particularly this idea of structural transformation, is certainly very clear. However, I think it's important to dig a little deeper when we're looking at, let's say, the increase in employment in industry and services and the decrease in employment in agriculture. Because particularly recently, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen that increase in industry or employment in industry, or the sector as a whole, has largely been because of the subsector of construction. A combination of post-tsunami reconstruction. I mean, the tsunami wreaked havoc around vast amounts of our coastline, and the post-tsunami reconstruction effort with very generous aid pouring in, plus the post-war or pre-war and post-war reconstruction. All of this has meant that the construction sector has been, or subsector has been, one of the fastest growing. So in industry, we need to remember that a lot of it has been driven by construction. In services, a lot of the recent growth has been actually driven by subsectors like wholesale and retail trade, transport, communications. So the message I'm trying to leave here is that when we're looking at the structural transformation towards industry and services, we're seeing that a lot of it has happened in these domestic non-tradables of industry and services, rather than the tradable manufacturing and tradable services. In fact, exports, while we've made very, very steady progress in the last 10 years or so, exports to GDP have in fact declined sharply, and that's worrying. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second point I want to make is so we talked about industry and services. Let's just on the point on agriculture. I think it's important to remember that in agriculture, we see a shift away. We see a shift away from people engaged in agriculture, but still we don't see that increase in labor productivity. And I think that's very clearly shown in the report, figure 7 in the report. If you get a chance, those of you in the audience, if you get a chance to take a look, figure 7 for me is quite revealing, because you see labor productivity in industry and services, but in agriculture, you can see that it really hasn't performed well at all. And this has strong implications on the value that is captured by the folks in agriculture, in rural areas. Because while there has been a decline in employment in agriculture, when you look at a regional, sort of like a spatial look at that performance, there are several districts, several regions of the country that are still very much agriculture based. And I think Laura did mention that this idea of regional disparities, because it could range from 30% an average to, in some regions, 50% of people in those regions engaged in agriculture. And this, I know poverty wasn't a large focus of this report, but if you take how that employment and that dynamic influences poverty in many areas where poverty is stubbornly high and has remained stubbornly high for years, many of those regions are dominated by a large agricultural workforce. So let me move on to my third point, and this I think you'll find interesting. I don't know how it will resonate with Europe as well. I think while the progress in unemployment has been remarkable, but for me, this persistent high youth unemployment is troubling. And I know I'm speaking to folks in Europe, where many countries are struggling with exceedingly high youth unemployment rates. So we really shouldn't be complaining, but this has been quite sticky in Sri Lanka, where unemployment levels have fallen to about 4%, but youth unemployment levels are at 19%. And the fact that this persists, the fact that this mismatch is still there, is troubling. Within this, a little additional concern on women, unemployment rates of young females and educated young females as well, where the unemployment rate is as high as 25%. I think the report touches on this idea of queuing or waiting, this queuing phenomenon. And we saw that earlier, I think in the early 1990s, but I see it coming back. So in the 1990s and up to the early 2000s, the private sector jobs expanded fairly in line with aspirations of young people and education levels. The export processing zones, the industrialization around that did manage to cater to these, to the types of jobs people were looking for. But we're now seeing this queuing or waiting phenomenon coming back again because aspirations have moved even further. And I often see that these attitudes and aspirations on the type of work that young people are seeking, particularly young men and women in rural areas, is moving faster than the economic transformation taking place and the job opportunities that are emerging out of that. So a line that I sometimes use is that, I'm seeing people with blue-collar skills, a large proportion of people with blue-collar skills aspiring to white-collar jobs. And that is really causing a lot of friction because they're choosing to wait. They're waiting out of the labor force, and they're choosing to wait for those jobs to appear. And that I think is driving a big part of this youth unemployment phenomenon. Moving to my fourth point, links to that. This idea that if Sri Lanka wants to, now we are in lower middle income, we're aspiring to be upper middle income and beyond. How do we then gear our workforce, particularly these youth who are aspiring to white-collar jobs, to actually have those white-collar skills or have the education that is geared to that? And that is where this big challenge of education comes into play, and it is looked at in the report, but I want to stress on it again because Sri Lanka just can't aspire to that level of development with a tertiary enrollment rate of just 15%, whereas its middle income peers are seeing double that level of tertiary enrollment. So I think that narrow tertiary enrollment group will really constrain and will again have a knock-on effect on employment trends in the future. The one before the last point, I think it's. I thought of this when I read. I think it's one of your colleagues who wrote about where will the next round of employment come from. I think his name is Tom Berner. He had written about where will the next round of jobs come from, and these changes happening in industrialization. So in Sri Lanka, in the first wave in the 1990s, first wave of liberalization onwards, we saw the garments industry really booming. And I really want, and I think that is the story, that is the real story that we're capturing in this employment progress. But moving forward, that sector, there's a lot of flux in that sector. And that sector, like Laura mentioned, it employs a lot of people. It's a large part of our exports. It's a large part of the economy. It's a large part of industrial output. But whether that will be a driver of the next wave of employment is a question mark for me, because Sri Lanka, not that the sector is not going to grow, but the sector is going to do much better on the higher value segment. And a lot of the very competent firms that we're seeing are going towards automation, robotics, higher value using nanotechnology. Some are even moving away from the regular stitching to some apparel firms are looking at Silicon Valley to acquire companies that have clever software solutions for garments. So some of the most competitive and successful Sri Lankan garment manufacturers 10 years from now may not be stitching anything at all, but they will still be some of the largest designers of providers of design solutions and software solutions for the global apparel industry. So that sector that had been a big provider of employment in the past, for me, going forward is worrying. So then if we're looking at then if we're looking at what kind of employment will be generated next, we need to look at Sri Lanka's FDI performance. So you're seeing post-war FDI performance fairly weak, just 2% of GDP compared to its peers who are doing about 4 to 6%. Exports and openness, again mentioned in the report that a big part of this progress was embracing export orientation. But in the last 3, 4, 5 years, we're seeing that getting rolled back, where average protection rates, sometimes which you don't capture in even when I look at openness of the economy, things like para-tariffs, which are adding layers and layers of export protectionism in the last couple of years, and it's beyond the scope of this report. So in the last couple of years, we're seeing average tariff protection rates rising to about 25%, double that of what the rates were during this solid employment progress era. So I'm going to get to my last point, and that really picks up on what Bruce mentioned. It really is now about the next generation of reforms to drive growth and competitiveness, to drive employment equitably across the country. And this is where we need to bring in political economy angles to it, because we know that there was a very strong political majority enjoyed by the previous president, Mahinda Rajapaksa. But we didn't see the kind of reforms to factor markets, key input markets that could drive growth for 10, 20 years at 6, 7, 8%. So now, following the election of President Maithripala Sirisena and that this coalition, which doesn't have that kind of strong political backing and focus largely is not on the economics, but it's on constitutional reform, we're not seeing the first 4 to 6 months or the 100-day program, as they say, tackling anything to do with economic policy reforms. The focus largely is on bringing back law and order, strengthening institutions, or investigating corruption. Then moving forward, if there is an election towards the end of the year, the next regime also, it's likely will not have the kind of political might, the huge majorities in parliament that are often required for some of these key reforms to go through, and that they are tough reforms. and they do have an impact on employment generation. Trade and investment, like I said, we've slipped back a little on our openness, going back again to greater openness, free trade agreements, that kind of stuff on the trade and investment regime. Labor market reform, some very restrictive 100-plus-year-old labor regulations that are hurting firm growth and that are encouraging informality. On education, tertiary education, on social protection, on the high subsidies that are encouraging people to stay more rural. So all of this, I think, needs to be tackled, and it'll be interesting to see how it pans out in the next few months and years, because I think there's a greater recognition now that the kind of drivers of growth that help this employment progress discussed in our report, those factors will no longer be in play, and we have to almost reinvigorate growth, and the reforms required for that are pretty urgent. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.